Thanks very much, Wendy. First of all, I have to stress that actually the ECB project was a bit more gender balanced than you see in front of you.
Thank you, Jock. I meant to say that.
We did try our best, and actually in the audience, if we take a sort of sample of former ECB, it's a bit more balanced. We did try our best to make it a bit more gender balanced, but we didn't. That's one of the challenges I guess we have to talk about. Otherwise, yeah, I'll just briefly kind of give you a few highlights from the paper, if you like, in the hopes that this would stimulate a more thorough reading, and I actually look forward to a good discussion afterwards, so try and keep it short. So Wendy mentioned 2003. That's probably more of a gleam of in the eye type thing. That's when the discussions really started. The project itself, the first phase, started actually in March 1st, 2005. It was supposed to start on January 1st of that year, but of course 4 days before that there was an Asian tsunami, so that was kind of, it not only delayed the project, but it kind of gave us, if you like, okay, so this does make sense, because there's a lot of dialogue in terms of, okay, does it really, does it make sense to do collaboration where there's all these other types of things? And the tsunami kind of underlined that, and it gave us, the kind of the subtitle here is, can we learn from during emergencies? Well, it's difficult, but actually you do, and the tsunami provided that the first opportunity really for us to collaborate in a way that we thought, okay, well, we're starting this project, how can we use this response to actually kick this thing off? And so we did joint evaluations, and we already learned some stuff while we were responding. This was a time when humanitarian reform was perhaps a gleam in the eye of Jan Egeland, but nobody knew about it yet. HAP International had just started as a partnership. There was no standard. So, this was a very different context for those of us in this field. And so the word of the day was very much competition. If you look at the literature at that time, there's all these talk of competition between agencies. So it was a different time. Phase one, so basically we started dialoguing with the Gates Foundation, saying we want to do this collaboration, which came out of what we call the IWG principles called list of pain points. In other words, they met together, okay, what are the common challenges we're facing? What are the top ones? And where does it make sense for us to work together? And that's the list we took to Gates and a few other people just to kind of validate it. So Gates said, oh, looks interesting. You asked for 5 years. Let's do a 2-year trial and see how it goes. So it was 2 years. Same objectives, of course, but it was 2 years instead of 5, and a lot less money. 2 million instead of 5. At the end of it, the conclusion was, yeah, this does make sense. It makes sense to go ahead. And so after a bit of a break, the phase 2 started in 2008, I believe, is it? Around that time. Yeah. And that time, it was for a 5-year thing. But anticipated budget was $12 million, I think, of which Gates provided 5, and then we had to look for the rest. And that was one of the challenges, as we'll hear later. Okay, so in terms of what happened, that's almost a decade, including the kind of gap between the two, and no cost, the usual no cost extensions. So what happened? I mean, the biggest thing was probably the changed way of working. That you got a very, and those, perhaps I could say from my perspective, from the AIM advisor, the accountability advisor with CARE, there's some other ones here, from other agencies. I mean, it was a really good team, and so it was kind of a super community of practice. But the really conclusion, one of the main conclusions at the end of phase 1 was that what was really exciting, what was happening at collaboration at field level in countries. So that became the focus of the second phase, is really to, so it started with a call for proposals from countries. You want to collaborate, so what types of things you want to try, okay, and they were selected based on the regions, so there ended up with 5 consortia in different regions. The other one of the objectives in the second one was looking out. So this wasn't just to build capacity of the agencies themselves, the 6 agencies themselves. It was really to provide some benefit to the humanitarian community as a whole. And there, one of the big advantages that we got back from our kind of partners is that ECB is like the perfect docking station, because here you have these community practices that represent 6 large NGOs that you can immediately go to without going through the directors and the usual channels, then that gave rise to things like the collaborations with ACAPs in joint assessments, which we'll probably hear from Bangladesh, was one of the really key activities. Lots of challenges, and Graham, I won't go into too much detail because Graham has a few of those there in terms of management, governance. I mentioned the fundraising, that there was, we were doing exciting things, but also we have to raise money. And so this is a personal perspective. It's not official ECB. Those of you that have seen Social Networking, the film, there's a scene in there where Mark Zuckerberg is debating with his chief financial officer, should we go advertising? No, it's just exciting, there's stuff going on. So, and then Sean, the founder of Napster, he's pushing for Silicon Valley because they just fund, interesting ideas. So for me, my own take on that was Gates was kind of the Silicon Valley part. They were willing to provide some experimental, encourage innovation, but this sort of match required us to go into more traditional fundraising things and this sort of project implementation mode, which I felt kind of took away the innovation, that sort of possibility, kind of restricted the space. And then at the end, the kind of learning, on page 13, there's a kind of learning process over time, this sort of diagram here, which kind of shows, it shows what the difference is, that we have guidelines in terms of how you should do these things, but actually this sort of putting people into, one of the obligations of the consortia was that they had to not just do, but they had to learn from what they're doing. And Indonesia provided, well, not just Indonesia, but this is one example of a consortia where you could clearly see how they learned themselves and they improved over time, just by learning by doing with a bit of support from outside. And that was happening in many of the consortia. So at the end of this paper, I provide, so in the hopes that ECB, well, actually I know that ECB is continuing in different forms. It may not have an ECB label on it, but what's been learned from the ECB project is being used. I can confirm that. But in terms of those collaborations, it's probably the way to the future. It's probably much more country level. And so I just tried to capture some of the key learnings so that anybody trying this thing in future can benefit from that. One of the things was that what we found worked best is this sort of very working on a kind of rallying around a practical tool or a guidance or something. So we have the Good Enough Guide. We've got the joint assessments. These were things where people felt the direct benefit. And for me, sitting in headquarters, you actually got positive feedback from the field, which is too rare, as those of you know. It also depended a lot on the alignment between the work plan of the ECB project and what our own work plans were. So for the accountability advisor, because by definition we're looking at what it looks like from a community perspective, that seemed to be much easier than some of the other groups, I think, because we're all there helping the same people, so it makes sense to coordinate on that. In the initial phase, they didn't have any general communications capacity, and that caused a huge transaction costs. Why are we doing this? what about all these other, what's different about this than something else? What are the objectives of this? Everybody was explaining their own way in huge confusion. And then that's an example of where they added a communications person, things just sorted themselves out. So the other thing is that the the ECB projects have ended. So is there something left? Yes. Do they have ECB labels on them? Most of them don't. So that's kind of, and that's linked into another challenge, which was, how do you actually do monitoring evaluation for a project like this? What is monitoring evaluation? What are the results, the outcomes of this collaboration, and how do you benefit? Well, if I'm DFID, what's the value for money for this thing? It's not easy to measure. So I'll stop there and hand it over.
Thanks very much, Jock. Now, I think you've raised some interesting points. I think one of the tension between achieving the operational objectives and the transformational objectives is a really interesting one, where you're trying to really change the way that you're working and looking at things, but at the same time you have to deliver. That's an important tension. I think also in the paper what stood out for me too is that it's important, I think the project found it's important to have these partnerships with like-minded organizations, but that strategic partnerships with organizations like ACAPS, for example, were also really important and turned things around in some cases. So I'm going to hand over to Graham now and get his perspectives, being one of the principals. Thanks.